All right, well, good morning to everyone. As Lisa said, my name is Helms. I'm the Children and Families Pastor here. I recognize many of you from either classes or seeing you in church, but for those of you who I haven't had the chance of working with, I'm often hidden away up on the fourth floor on many Sundays teaching our fifth graders and younger, so it's great to be with you all. As Lucy was saying, we are really trying to take a big, broad sweep throughout the Bible, but one of the biggest challenges that we faced is how to do this over the course of 40-odd Sundays. One of the tasks that we were kind of challenged with was thinking about if you could only select 40 chapters from the entire biblical text that you think would be basically a sum-up, overarching way through the Bible, what would you pick? I think that's an interesting exercise for all of us to do. We're going to do it on our own time. But for a lot of us, Genesis 1, it was hard to cut that out. After all, it is the beginning. And so we thought that it could not be more appropriate to begin with this incredibly foundational text for our series on the foundations of faith. Before we get to the actual biblical text, though, I do have just a kind of few housekeeping things. Some of you may have seen as we were walking in, we were handing out a sheet of, or maybe not handing out, you can pick it up, guidelines for respectful engagement. These are basically sort of a commitment and a covenant for us as we go through these classes together. This is not in response to any particular incident. I don't want you all to feel like you're being scolded within the first minute of class. This is just for us a way to acknowledge that this course and this series are going to take us on a massive sweep. Different associate pastors will have different perspectives, and truly all of us bring different perspectives to the biblical text, and that is, in my opinion, a beautiful thing. I'd like to start most of my classes by saying, I am not an infallible teacher. I'm going to have verbal mistakes here and there. I may even have content mistakes. I will always do my best to own up to those. I'm willing to be challenged and willing to hear feedback. But I do think it's important to get that out from the outset. Part of what it means to commit to learning about the Bible and reading through the Bible is to take the time to dig in yourself and to not just allow someone else to give you all the answers. One of the things we really believe as Reformed Christians is that all of us have a responsibility to dig into the biblical text. So with that, I do also want to note for all of us something that our denomination has lifted up in terms of helpful guidelines in terms of how we read and understand the Bible. There are 7 guidelines, the first of which is the centrality of Jesus. These were all lifted up when our denomination reunited the northern and southern streams back in 1983. So the centrality of Jesus means that although not every text witnesses to Jesus, and indeed throughout this sweep through the Old Testament, you're not going to hear Jesus explicitly named, we nonetheless believe that lessons that we draw and take away for our everyday life should nonetheless be reflected and consistent with what Jesus taught. Focus on the plain text. To me, this is one of the more confusing of these recommendations, because that sounds like literalism. That is not what was meant by the General Assembly at that time. But what it means is that we, as best we can, focus on the words that are being read as sort of our foundation for whether we are thinking of it literally or through the lens of metaphor, whether we are reading our own context into it. We first need to start with the biblical text and to analyze that before we lump anything else that we're bringing to it on it. We depend on the guidance of the Holy Spirit. This one is absolutely crucial. All of us believe that the Holy Spirit is continually providing us with new eyes and new vision, and we are continually learning lessons from the biblical text through the Holy Spirit's help. That things that we may read today aren't things that would have been read decades ago, and we believe that that's part of the ongoing revelation of God's Spirit. Guided by the rule of faith, and a very similar one, guided by the rule of love. These two things are crucial in terms of reading these texts within the wider biblical corpus. When you think about the rule of love, and you think about some of the violence that exists in the Old Testament, we do not read, as Presbyterians, we don't read that as appropriate for us today. We view it through the wider lens and context of the overarching biblical text and of Jesus' example of nonviolence. The need for earnest study is one that I already kind of alluded to, but it's important for all of us to really dig into the text ourselves and to spend time. And finally, we look to interpret passages in light of the entire biblical text. Unfortunately, that means we also need to really know the biblical text, and that's always a challenge when you're dealing with a book that is over 2,000 pages in most printings. So, with all that in mind, one other thing that we're going to be lifting up and something that we're going to structure our classes by is that we're going to be thinking about our biblical chapters. I know it's kind of a tight angle for those who are on the edge, my apologies. We're going to be thinking about it from two different lenses. One is the passage then, so going back to when the authors would have written this, what the context would have been like. But also we're going to think about what does this passage mean for us now? We aren't thinking about these in a vacuum. We read them today because they have meaning and impact on us and how we live our lives. And so we wanted to juggle as best we can. You can let me know if I did a good job of that. To try to juggle the context in which these passages, take a moment, whether you are reading or whether you're just listening, to actually hear or see these words from Genesis 1 again. I am going to bleed a little bit into Genesis 2. Some of you will remember that the first four verses are connected. The first four verses of Genesis 2 are connected to Genesis 1. But so let's listen again with open ears and open hearts. So in the beginning, when God created the heavens and earth, the earth was formless and void and covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And so God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on the earth, that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." And so God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, every cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw that everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good, and there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. And thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done. He rested on the seventh day from all of the work that he had done. And so God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all work that he had done in creation. These are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created. Amen. So what was that experience like, hearing the entirety of Genesis 1 read? What pops out to you as you hear this, based on what you remembered as you were going into it? Yeah.
He said it was, and he said it is good.
It is good. That repeated refrain all throughout the text. Yes.
And this reminds me of how we've got to keep Mother Earth good today.
Indeed.
Yes, and that's why that popped out at me so, because a lot of things are happening that are kind of polluting our environment, atmosphere, and the oceans.
Absolutely.
To which are just essential.
Absolutely. So thank you, Sue. Anyone else, things that popped out to you as you heard this on a passage that you may not have read or heard in quite some time? Yes.
Seeds sort of popped up for me.
Yeah.
It was in every fruit and every thing has a seed, and the seeds are in it. And that's how things propagate.
Yeah. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
So to the point of it being pronounced good, my mind got snagged on the fact that on day 2 he didn't call it good.
Really?
Yes.
Oh.
I know.
Okay.
I missed that.
You caught me off guard. I would have just assumed that, so, all
I
right.
missed it when I read it the first time.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah, I guess I missed it.
All right. Well, I have no answer to that immediately, but I'm going to go back to that for sure. So, an interesting. I very much would have assumed that was
Can
the
you
case.
repeat what she said?
She said that on the second day, God did not pronounce it good. I would assume that. All right, I'm going to resist the urge to dive into it right now, but we'll probably have an addendum at the end of next class. Sir. In any case, well, thank you for that note. Yes.
The creation sequence follows the same sequence as natural history, which is important for Christians who believe in both science and the text.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you all. Oh, yes.
I think at the beginning, when you think of this big blob of darkness and water, and it's almost an overwhelming concept, and it's almost frightening to think of what the earth was like at the start.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and we'll get into a few questions around that formless void as it's translated. But that's a great point. Yeah. The kind of frighteningness of it. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm always struck by that. Let us make humankind in our image.
Yeah.
So it's not let me individually, but it's the narrator sees it as a collective.
And we'll touch on that ever so briefly a little bit later. But that's a good note. Yeah. It does jump out to us. Yes.
It's interesting that we have a demarcation of days, the first day, the second day, the third day, and we think of the days as separated by sun up, sundown, but he doesn't even invent the sun until the fourth day. So there's light on the first day, but then the works and all that.
So it's funny you should bring that up. We will get to a first century interpreter who had issue with that as well. But yeah, it's an interesting point. Yeah.
Of course, I've read this over the years many times, and as I came to have problems with the cosmology of it, I think I've settled on that, it's a beautiful, poetic way to develop a relationship with God. So it's for me, it's kind of moved from old science to modern day relationship. So.
Sure. Yeah, so that feels like, do we have any other quick thoughts? So I thank you all for being willing to share. Part of the reason I'm asking this is all of us inevitably bring things to this text. We also learn things from this text, but all of us can see it differently. That does not mean that any of us are wrong. Part of what it means to be a faithful Christian is to really invest that time and energy into hearing afresh with new ears, and to studying and to learning. One of the things that I want to do as we continue thinking about what this text would have meant back in its original audience for the original author, whoever he or she was, probably he, but possibly a she, I suppose. The exegetical questions that arise from this text, particularly for those of us who are studying this today, the first of which I would lift up as understanding that this is a translation from Hebrew. Most of you, I'm sure, are aware that the vast majority of the Old Testament, with a few exceptions in Aramaic, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. And to what degree that presents challenges for us as English readers for understanding that text. I want to lift up a few notes in particular, and what makes it fun is that all of these notes come from the first two verses within the biblical text. So if you go to that opening line, so in the beginning, when God created the heavens and earth, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. So that phrase, in the beginning, when God created, comes from a Hebrew word, bereshit, which can very much be translated that way. There's a reason the NRSV picked it. But it can also be translated, when God began to create. So here, listen to this in the two different contexts. So, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was a formless void. Do you notice a distinction there? So there's in the beginning, there is creation, what is often referred to as creation ex nihilo, which is creation out of nothing. In the second one, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was a formless void. That seems to presume a currently present matter that God is then shaping and ordering. In Hebrew, either of those readings are perfectly acceptable by grammar. So which is it? The answer is, it could logically be interpreted either way. However, the way that we translate that Hebrew has a drastic change in understanding of how we think about God's creation. Was God creating everything from nothing? Or was God taking this formless substance and putting order into it? The Hebrew allows for both. Yes?
So the Common English Bible, which is the one we
Yes.
used when we did read the Bible in a year in 2012,
Gotcha, yeah.
says when God began to create the heavens and the earth was without shape or form.
Okay.
It was dark over the deep sea, and God's wind swept over the waters, etc.
So they lean more in the other
Yeah,
direction.
right.
And like I said, either are a permissible one by Hebrew grammar. Did you have a?
No.
Oh, okay. So to me, that's an interesting question that arises literally from the first word in the Hebrew Bible. These translations that we do of Hebrew matter. Sometimes these translations are clear-cut. Sometimes they are not. And they have great implications for us as we interpret and understand. For a second one, I believe this is at the in the second verse. So you hear the earth was formless and void, or the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. So that phrase, the earth was a formless void. Some of you may have heard this just because it's a fun phrase. The Hebrew is tohu wabohu. That phrase, tohu wabohu, tohu appears a few other times in the biblical text. Bohu does not appear at all outside of this phrase being combined together. And this idea of formless void is the best guess that we have connected to the meaning of tohu, meaning wasteness. But in terms of knowing what bohu means, kind of lost the time. Now, that's an interesting and fascinating thing when you talk about the earth was, the earth was what? We have a pretty good understanding and belief that formless void is a good translation. But I do think it's important to note that we don't have a specific understanding of what that Hebrew phrase meant. And so when we are bringing our understanding to the text, it's important to note that part of the reason why we get into such disagreements as a wider church family is that we have different readings of these texts, different understandings of these texts, all of which, as you're pointing out, are rooted in the Hebrew. The last one that I'll lift up, and this is one that I use often because it's kind of crucial in my eyes. The two most dominant translations that you'll see out in the kind of English translation world are the NRSV, which our church uses, and the NIV, which is a very common translation as well. In the second verse, it talks about darkness covered the face of the deep, and then in our NSV it says, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Now, that phrase wind comes from a Hebrew word ruach, which means breath, wind, spirit. If you think back in the ancient world, it makes perfect sense that these things would be connected. The breath of life, one's spirit, would have been understood as breath. But when you have a word ruach, which is used throughout the Hebrew text both as breath and as spirit at varying points, what does that mean? Does that mean a wind from God is going over the face of the waters? Or does that mean God's Spirit, what we would understand as the Holy Spirit, as being present in the water? What an incredibly important distinction for us as readers and translators. And so this question is another example of how sometimes when we read the text, we're missing some of these nuances within the Hebrew that make an absolutely vital and important difference for the meaning that we take away. The other things in terms of exegetical questions that are raised for me are what biases and lenses do we bring to the text? All of us bring those, and I think that's important for us to sort of self-examine. We've gotten into a little bit of that, but one of the most dominant ones, particularly when it comes to Genesis 1, is the idea of, do we bring a very literal reading of this text? Do we bring, as Ted was mentioning, a sort of metaphorical, poetic reading? There are issues about what current events. Sue had referenced things going on the planet right now, and for those of us at this particular place in history, when we hear this passage, our mind goes there automatically.
I'm still
Oh,
interested
well,
in that.
sure.
About the second day, why he didn't acknowledge.
I will love to get you the answer for that. So later on, when we break up into small groups, you better believe I'm going to be studying up on that. And hopefully, I'll have a little bit of an
Not
answer.
today, but we have to
But
wait.
we'll see by the end of the day. But we're going to keep on going. So these current events are very important in terms of what we bring. How does this account fit into the wider biblical text? Those of you who have even if you haven't read cover to cover, those of you who have read Revelation, the sort of the conclusion of the biblical text, will note that God goes through a sort of second creation, drawing on a lot of the language and themes that we see in this Genesis 1 text. And so how does this account weave itself throughout the biblical text is a very important question. And finally, what is the literary, historical, and theological context of this passage? And I'd like to take a moment to dive into each of those three separately. So first, I'd love to look at the literary context. Now, this may sound bizarre. It is a bit of an artifice and framework that we as modern readers bring. I think that most people in the biblical world wouldn't have approached it from asking what genre this text might apply to. The question probably wouldn't have made any sense whatsoever. But for us, it gets into some of the roots of disagreement that are often brought to this text. Is Genesis 1 written as history? Is it an allegory? Is it an ancient scientific cosmology, an understanding of the cosmos? Is it what would be labeled as a creation myth? Your answer to that question, I imagine most of us come feeling one way or the other, matters a lot for how this text is interpreted. For those who view it from the lens of history, that this would be a literal accounting of events, a sort of like box by box walk through how God created all things.
Meaning the number of days too.
Yeah, and so I do. You see the number of days up there in quotes. You'll have some the day yom behind it can sometimes refer to a time period, and so you'll have folks who stick to a sort of literal understanding of this, but who would say, well, it wasn't a 24-hour day; it was a time period. So you'll have folks make that argument based on that Hebrew yom. But when you're reading it as history, it reads as a literal account of the biblical text. There are others who approach this from the lens of allegory, that this is a sort of poetic retelling of the creation story. that helps us to understand fundamentals about who God is, rather than this is a scientific textbook that tells us how creation was made. Cosmology, I think I heard someone reference that word before. This would sort of be an early scientific understanding of how the ordering of the universe came into being, but that the expectation is that it would be supplemented as new scientific discoveries came in. St. Augustine actually had that view. We're going to get to him a little bit later. But that is a reading that is brought to this text sometime. And finally, creation myth. We carry a negative connotation around the word myth and equate it with falseness in our culture. We see myths as being false. That is not something that would have been held in the ancient world. The creation myth was, you could just say, an origin story. These sort of creation myths were held in a wide variety of cultures. We're even going to get into a few of those now. But those convey truths, values, and ideas that were held by the ancient Israelites. And so what our task is as modern readers is to study and incorporate those lessons into our lives today. And finally, you'll have others who approach this and just say that it's blended. I kind of lean more in this direction, that this text doesn't really belong into any single genre, in part because the author probably wasn't writing it in terms of a genre. That's sort of a modern framework that we place on it. But I think it's important to recognize that if all of these things are existing in the midst of the text, it's an important way for us to look at its meaning from a wide variety of different perspectives, because it does have a lot to teach us. So for those of you who are, as you listen to the biblical text, particularly in those first, I would say 10 verses or so, you might hear some things, particularly around the separations of waters, that sound a bit puzzling to our modern ears. It's going to be really difficult to see, so I'll try to explain it. What scholars have theorized was a sort of version of an ancient Hebrew cosmology. You'll see a separation. There's down here is Tehom, or the Great Deep. This would be the roughly equivalent to this sort of unformed void, this sort of chaos of the world. The upper seas, you could think about it as an answer to the question of why is the sky blue? Why does it rain? There are waters above the heavens that is separated by rakia, or the firmament. The word rakia literally means like a piece of metal hammered out incredibly thinly. That there is this separation between the upper seas and the lower seas, and that would explain the blueness of the skies. You also hear in the midst of that there are places affixed for the stars, for the moon, for the sun. And then you have earth, dry ground created. The seas, if you think about back in ancient Israel, the Mediterranean was really the primary wide sea, the big body of water. For them, that would have been the great deep in terms of their conception of the world around them. And then Sheol, this would be functionally like the afterlife within ancient Hebrew society, although it looks a bit different than the heaven and hell that we conceive of. Probably the closest conception would be sort of just a muted existence in the afterlife. It would have some similarity with the Greek conception of afterlife. But that word Sheol is something you'll see pop up throughout the Psalms and through other texts as well. So it's believed that this was, for many ancient Hebrews, their concept of how the universe was arranged. So going further into the historical context, particularly around the question of what do we know about when and where this Genesis 1 text was written. It was long believed that the not just Genesis, but the entirety of the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible, was written by Moses. You hear early church fathers writing about this. With limited exceptions, over the years there were particular verses that talk about the Hebrews' presence in the land to this day. At the end of Deuteronomy, Moses dies and the story continues. Obviously, those weren't written by Moses, but it was believed that there were a few sentences here and there that were added by later writers. In the European Enlightenment, however, and particularly Baruch Spinoza is a name that might be familiar to some of you, was really one of the first prominent voices to come out against Mosaic authorship. And that has kind of continued in modern scholarship to the point that most scholars today would say that this creation account was finalized somewhere between the 7th and 5th century BCE, that this was written perhaps around or in response to the exile, whether it was an accounting and writing in the midst of exile, as there was worry that these oral traditions would be lost, whether this was in a return from exile and the sort of rebirth that Israel was experiencing in that time, but that this creation account would date back to then, with the caveat that it almost certainly incorporates earlier material. However, there are pieces within this text, particularly with some of the striking differences between this text and other ancient Near East creation myths, that help us to believe that this would have been a little bit later in the biblical corpus. Some of you may have heard the term documentary hypothesis before. If you haven't heard that, you've heard of the JEDP. I'm not going to get into all of that right now, in part because it's still very much in dispute in the scholarly community. The upshot of it is a belief that the biblical corpus, as we have it, the Old Testament, would have been either created in stages over time with written pieces being added on, or that there were sort of, the documentary hypothesis proposes 4 sort of major documents or collections that would have been synthesized together. This particular text is often attributed to P, or the priestly source, which again is one coming right out of this either in exile or more than likely post-exilic time period in which a lot of these texts were truly coming together. It would have been, by this theory, one of the kind of latest rounds of kind of redaction and editing and synthesizing.
And
Now again,
we're talking about the exile of Babylon.
Yes, the exile of Babylon, yes. So would have taken place in 586, returning roughly in the 530s, kind of a delayed thing. But so this would probably be, by this theory, in the sort of 530 to 500 sort of range. However, at the end of the day, dating it specifically falls into the category of trivia for me. It's not ultimately as important as the meaning behind it. However, I do think it's important for helping us understand. Now, in terms of other parallels within the ancient Near East, many of you have probably heard that there are other sort of creation myths that bear some vague similarity to the biblical text. There are 2 that I'd like to lift up, but I do want to take the time to note both, not just the similarities, but their differences. So the first one is from the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation myth that was thought to date back to the 2nd millennium BCE. So these are the first few lines of the Enuma Elish. So listen to it and see if anything flags for you as similar or different to the Genesis 1 account. So when on high the heaven had not yet been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mamu Tiamat, she who bore them all. Their waters were commingling as a single body. So you see a few similarities there, but also some key and important differences. You have this idea of naming being crucial in terms of the act of creation. When it says that a high heaven had not been named, firm ground had not been called by name, there's a sort of speaking into being that's very important in both stories. You have this ordering of skies and grounds that is present, and also this idea of a sort of watery chaos, these two commingling bodies. Now that's about, for me, where the similarities stop. You see in this text, in particular as you continue reading on, something that's very common in ancient creation myths, a sort of anthropomorphism. Sorry, it's a long word. Anthropomorphism is attributing human characteristics to non-human things, whether those are animals or whether those are gods. You think about the Greek pantheon, or really any ancient pantheon, and the way that the gods argue and fight with one another. You get that a little bit in this story, and indeed as it goes on. This sort of dispute between Apsu and Mamu Tiamat, that this clash is the creation. There is absolutely none of that within the Genesis text, yes.
Can I just ask, what is the Enuma Elish?
Oh, sure. So it is an ancient Babylonian creation myth.
How do you
Thought,
spell that?
as it's written there.
Oh,
So this sort of sense of anthropomorphism is present throughout. There's also, you can see there's two gods listed, and as you continue on through the Enuma Elish, there are other gods listed as well. Obviously not the case within the Hebrew text. It's very clearly one God. However, as Lucy alluded to, there's one curious line within the Genesis text that says, let us create, I'll look at the specific verse. Sorry, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. Now that's not a mistranslation, it is plural within the Hebrew. This dates back to probably in ancient Israelite society, even sort of if you're a believer in this idea that this was formed over time. This text, the word Elohim means God within Hebrew, but also refers to sort of a pantheon of gods. You get hints of that in other biblical texts. The one that's immediately jumping to mind is Job, but you'll see it elsewhere as well. There was this idea that there was sort of a lesser, more subservient, I don't want to say pantheon because that is the Greek connection, that there were other gods but that they served God. Now the interesting piece in all of this is, unlike other creation myths, creation is all listed in terms of the parsing the verbs as being done singularly rather than plural. It's clear that God alone is actor, and yet you have this sort of reference, whether you want to look back on that as sort of speaking to angels or otherwise. But it is interesting to name that as sort of a bizarre reference to a plural in an account that is otherwise very clearly singular, particularly within the ancient world. And finally, you also notice that in the Genesis 1 text, there are no battles with monsters or this sort of fighting that takes place often within creation myths. This ordering of chaos in most ancient Near East myths is done through chaos and fighting and debating. There's absolutely none of that. It's just sort of spoken word and things immediately snap into order. That represents a stark difference from a lot of other ancient Near East
Kind of
stories.
scares me a little bit about Armageddon.
What? I'm sorry.
Yeah, about the thoughts on Armageddon.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to talk to you about that afterwards because I think that might be going a bit far from this text. But I'm happy to talk with you about that too later. So the other parallel, and this gets less into Genesis 1 as it does with the rest of the sort of quote unquote prehistory of Genesis from Genesis 1 through Genesis 11. The Atrahasis epic and the Sumerian flood story, both of which were from a similar sort of time period in the ancient Near East, have some level of connection to Noah and the story of the flood. You'll see a lot of similarities there. But again, there are also important and stark differences. So while there are parallels to this Genesis 1 text within the ancient world, there really are a lot of ways in which it stands in stark contrast to other books at that time. Now, I recognize we're 50 minutes to go. I'm going to start speeding up. Some theological questions. We already referenced this one, but was creation made out of nothing, or was it an ordering of pre-existing chaos? For me, the unity of God is one that comes through clearly within this text, particularly when you consider it within the context of the ancient world. We just noted this as well. God's granting of dominion to human beings is a really vital and important question. I am not familiar with, and to be fair, I haven't read every other ancient creation story, but I am unaware of any creation story granting this level of authority and responsibility to human beings. This stands as a marked contrast and is one that I think is important for us to grapple with. We'll return to this in terms of how we experience and understand the text today. God's creation is good. I heard a few people reference that earlier, this repeated refrain of good. What does it mean for creation to be good, knowing that in subsequent chapters, human beings corrupt this goodness and to grapple with what that means for us to be both corrupters, and then going all the way back to reading this through the lens of Christ. What does it mean that through Christ, for us to sort of restore this goodness to creation? And finally, God's ongoing involvement in creation. So God has created this, and as we'll see in Genesis 2, is still very actively ongoing. But the way that Genesis 1 leaves, it's that period of rest before returning again. So these are all questions for me that come out of the text, and there may be some for you. I'm so sorry to be on warp drive here. I really want to give us an opportunity to talk in groups as well. The last thing I'll do is go through some history of textual interpretation, how this story has been understood. The most notable for us today is its sort of debate at the 1925 Scopes trial, in which Darwinism, whether it could be taught in schools or not, was put up on trial, and this sort of literal versus metaphor debate was played out on a national stage. However, many people often think that this was the first time that there was sort of this dispute within either Christian or Jewish communities, and that is patently not true. You might be fascinated to know that there have been disputes about this since the earliest days of the church. I wish I could read the entirety of some of these. I know we don't have enough time, but you have both Basil of Caesarea, a very important church father, as well as Origen, sort of forcefully arguing for history. Basil, he lifted up, there are those truly who do not admit the common sense of scriptures, for whom water is not water, but some other nature. But for me, grass is grass. Plants are plants, fish are fish. I take everything in the literal sense. I am not ashamed of the gospel. And there was evening, and there was morning, and it was one day. So you have Basil's state. I have Origen in a question mark because he allows that there are allegories within the text. Never spells out specifically if he's referring to Genesis 1 in this, but he also speaks forcefully for literal readings. But then you also come to folks like Augustine. Many of us know Augustine best for the doctrine of original sin. However, Augustine was a prolific writer, and indeed actually wrote I guess it would have been a treatise on the literal interpretation of Genesis, in which he was sort of advocating against this view. And it has some great lines. So it not infrequently happens, it's something about the earth or the sky or other elements of this world, et cetera, even the motion. He keeps on going. So that all of these may be learned by reasoning and by experience, even by one who is not a Christian. It is disgraceful and ruinous and greatly to be avoided that non-Christians would hear a Christian speaking idiotically on these matters, and as if in accord with Christian writings, that what they say might scarcely keep the other person from laughing when they see how totally in error they are. In view of this, and keeping in mind constantly when dealing with the book of Genesis, I have, so far as I was able, explained in detail and set forth for consideration the meaning of passages, taking care not to affirm rashly some one meaning and the prejudice of the other perhaps better explanation. So essentially what Augustine is saying is that we are responsible for continuing to learn and to understand these texts, particularly by modern science, uses that forcefully. And finally, I lift up someone who very much saw this from the view of allegory. Philo was not a Christian, but he was a prominent Jewish scholar within the first century.
Who is this?
Philo of Alexandria.
Oh, Philo.
So he said, it would be a sign of great simplicity to think that the world was created in 6 days, or indeed at all in time, because time is the space of days and nights, and these things are what make time. When Moses said God completed his works on the 6th day, we must understand that he's not speaking of a number of days, but that he takes 6 as a perfect number. And so you hear Philo reading into the numbers that are given throughout this, and seeing that as sort of the foundation of what this text is communicating. Now, these are markedly different readings of Scripture, and these are taking place by some of the earliest and most prominent thinkers within our church family. For me, reading these, I think so often we see this sort of debate of literalism versus metaphor as a modern debate. And the reality is that faithful Christians have come to different conclusions for a long, long time. And to me, this tells me that it's incumbent on each of us to dig into the text ourselves and to think through, seriously, through study, where we fall on this matter. I'll skip this, although it's a great political cartoon. This was one of the charges that were often brought against, is that when you begin to see the Bible as every single word not being infallible, that you're inevitably just on this descent into atheism. I believe this cartoon was produced right around the time of the Scopes trial.
Can you read what it says on each of the steps there, Matt? Can you read what those say?
Sure. All right. So we have from Christianity, Bible not infallible, man not made in God's image, no miracles, no virgin birth, no deity, no atonement, no resurrection, agnosticism, atheism at the bottom. So it is a very pointed and serious cartoon because for the humor that I look at it and laugh, it is bringing up a very serious question of how do we treat the biblical text if we don't view it as every single word is infallible? How do we still respect and understand this as divinely inspired message from God and for it to be important in our lives? And that was the shift that I wanted to make into the biblical text now. Something that, now we have 8 whole minutes to get into. So this will inevitably fall a little bit short, but I'll just zoom through it pretty quickly. For me, every single time that I turn back to this text, one of the first things that I'm struck by is awe and wonder at the majesty of God's creation. That is sort of a foundational aspect that for all of us, I believe, should elicit worship as we marvel at creation's creator. That there are competing forces of order and chaos in this world, and God helping to bring order, but recognizing that chaos is part of our reality. And I think that this is something that unfortunately feels all too real for us today. And it's one of the things that we as Christians are called to work against, is the chaos of our world. God's proclamation that all of creation is good, this sort of subsequent fall and restoring through Christ, I think keeping that in mind is an important way that we often read this passage, is understanding that we have been charged with, empowered by the Holy Spirit and through Christ's example, to again treat creation as good and holy and created by God. And finally, this last one is the responsibility of human beings to care for creation, that this was a gift, but not only a gift, but we were given responsibility through this understanding of God giving dominion. For many, many years, this passage, that word dominion, was read as domination, that human beings owned it all, we could do whatever we wanted. And I think that is not a proper reading of that text. That idea of dominion is put in from the perspective of being a king or a ruler. And sure, one as king or ruler could rule with an iron fist and dominate, but that's not what makes a good ruler. And when we talk about looking in the wider biblical text, rulers who led that way weren't met with success. A more responsible reading of dominion is to see this as an immense responsibility for us and to grapple with what that means in our lives. Before we break into small groups for a whopping total of 5 minutes, I just want to share for me personally why this text has been impactful, because I think so often in these classes I lean too heavily on the history, and for me this text is one that I've actually returned to not only with coming into this role with the children's ministry, but in my role now as a parent. I think it has taken on a new life for me in thinking about that responsibility and what I am passing on both to the children of this church and in my family at home. It has caused changes in my life, both from the way that and again, I do want to preface all this by saying I'm not trying to be preachy that y'all need to be doing these things. I'm just saying this is how I have begun reading this text. That because of this charge to care for creation, I have made efforts in my life to better recycle. My wife and I are composting at home. I've been trying to switch to a vegetarian diet with mixed success, but really trying to move in that direction. It sounds so corny, but for me, reading these passages and hearing anew this sort of charge for us to be responsible and experiencing that responsibility has caused me to step back. And the text, and speaking of how the Spirit moves in me, or moves in all of us, it has given me a renewed sort of commitment to care for our planet and really for those that come after us, the generations that come after us. So again, I'm not trying to say that this should be the case for every single one of us. I'm not trying to preach the gospel of vegetarianism. But I guess the reason why I bring this up is that the biblical text should change how we as Christians interact with our world, interact with God's creation. That's why we're here. It's not just to learn about the history, it's for it to make an impact on our lives. And that impact may look very different than the impact I've let it have on mine. But I think it's vital for all of us to grapple with not just Genesis 1. Obviously, we're going to be going through a wider breadth. But to really grapple with the message of the biblical text and to ask, how is this changing my life? And what does this mean for me and how I should be treating myself, treating others, my relationship with God? To me, that's just vital. That's why we turn to the Bible. It is our best way to listen for God's voice in this world. So, sermon over. And I think I would love, maybe instead of groups of 3 to 6 people, if you'd be willing to just sort of turn to someone by you. I know we're not going to get to all of these, but if you'd like to pick out one of these 3 questions. How have you read or approached this Genesis 1 account of creation in the past? Did anything new strike you today? What themes, political issues, or social issues jump out of the text for you? And what are the issues and implications of this passage for our faith and our lives? If you'd be willing to turn to just one person near you, pick one of those 3 questions to answer, I'd be grateful. In the future, we're going to try to do this before 9:28 or 10:28. But we want this to be a fruitful class in that respect. So please turn to someone near you. I'm going to get looking at this.
Yeah, let's do